All right, well, welcome back to the Specialized Nutrition Support discussion presentation for Skills Lab, and this is part two of the series. So the end of session one, we talked about indirect calorimetry, and now we're going to talk about the second of the three different ways to estimate energy requirements. And so the second is the Harris-Benedict equation. And a little bit about this from a historical perspective. As you can see, this is the citation for Harris-Benedict, and it's literally almost 100 years old. And interestingly, for something that's almost 100 years old, it actually is still kind of fairly accurate in predicting this thing here, the BEE, which is basal energy expenditure. Where the equation got into trouble and where we started overfeeding people back about 30 to 40 years ago was when we applied stress factors and activity factors to the BEE that the Harris-Benedict equation provided us with. So the basal energy expenditure is basically like if you were laying down, sleeping, not moving at all. It's a theoretical value, by the way, but it's like if you had almost no movement and nothing, uh, disease-wise or anything like that going on. It's what would be your very basal or basic energy expenditure. So it's a little bit lower than what's real because there's always things going on. Your gut's working and other things are moving and things are healing wounds and stuff. But anyway, so it's usually a low number, like around 1,300 calories, 1,400 calories, pretty low amount. So Harris and Benedict back in 1919 would recommend applying these stress factors, like if somebody is sick or has a broken bone or if they're burned. And so it would be the BEE times 1.2 or 1.5, 1.7, and you would add the stress factors together. On top of that, you'd add activity factors to the stress factors and multiply that times the BE. So you ended up with like somebody who was able to walk around the hallway of the hospital, but they had pneumonia plus a broken arm. You have all these factors that were kind of building up and increasing what we thought they needed on top of the BEE. So you'd end up with something like 2 to 3 times as much calories as what we really need to give people. And as I'll get to in just a second, we know now that the actual amount that particularly patients in the hospital need from an energy standpoint is the BEE times about 1.1 to 1.3 on average. Really not much more than that at all, even for very sick, critically ill patients, trauma patients, even burn patients don't need a whole lot more than that. So in a nutshell, Harris-Benedict was good for some of it, but then when you started applying these stress and activity factors, it led to a lot of overfeeding. And in the previous segment, we talked about the complications of overfeeding. So it's still pretty good if you want to use it to calculate a basal energy expenditure. It factors in their weight, height, age, and gender. And then if you multiply that number by 1.2 to 1.3 at the most, it'll give you a pretty good ballpark figure of how many total calories the patient needs in a 24-hour period. Backing up a little bit, so we talked about indirect calorimetry in the previous session. That was Harris-Benedict, and the most commonly one used by most people is this weight-based dosing, kcals per kilogram per day. So it factors in the patient's weight, but more than that, that's what I wanted to get to here, is that it also factors in their medical condition. So general medical patients have some numbers that we can use, for example, 20 to 25 kcals per kilogram per day. Bone marrow transplant, or otherwise known as peripheral blood stem cell transplant, mostly with patients with leukemia and some other cancers, they need a little bit higher amount of calories based on their body weight. Surgery and trauma patients, kind of in the middle between those two. So you can see, and then there's, in this list here probably gets me in the ballpark of about 95% of the patients that I'll be consulted on at University Medical Center when recommending TPNs and calculating doses, writing orders. There's a few other things you can find for more specific diseases, but generally this covers most patients. So in addition here, we'll talk about this in a little while, is also the associated protein requirements for these types of patients. But right now we're just talking about the total kilocalories per kilogram per day. So that's how you would calculate it. You kind of pick which category your patient falls into, and anything within that range is okay. It's typical to go to the sort of middle of the road. If you want to be on the safe side, which I recommend, not being aggressive, but play it safe, especially when you're starting somebody out on nutrition support, go with the low end of these ranges. Because again, if you get more aggressive and push them to the higher ends, you do run the risk of overfeeding someone. Okay, so backing up a couple slides. One more. So now we know the three main ways of estimating someone's energy requirements. And again, like I mentioned earlier, what these equations do is they estimate how much energy somebody is burning per day. And so what we want to do is match what the ins and the outs. And so if we think they're burning, let's say 2,000 calories, then we want to provide 2,000 calories back to them so that they don't have to become undernourished or start burning body stores to meet their needs. And we don't want to give too much, because we know that once the patient's nutritional needs or energy requirements are met, they start to need to store the excess nutrients in things like the liver, and storing it as fat. So we don't want to do that either. So on this slide, the other thing need to be familiar with is the macronutrients. Of course, what they are, their role in metabolism and healthy nutrition, and also from a calculation standpoint, the associated kilocalories for every gram that's burned. So as the patient receives these substrates or macronutrients, how many calories would the patient be able to convert it to in terms of energy? Okay, a few notes here. There's also some other, this is about protein requirements. There are some situations, particularly with kidney and liver failure, where the numbers change. So this is the type of chart or dosing scheme that you'd want to be familiar with or try to find when you have somebody in one of these sort of special populations. But you can see the protein dose, it's usually between 1 and 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. So sometimes, depending on the dialysis, the type of dialysis, they need less or more than the average person. And just FYI, most people, otherwise healthy adults, typically need around 0.8 to 0.9 grams of protein per kilogram per day. So 1 is kind of an easy number to remember. You're always pretty safe with that. It's usually within most of the ranges. But typically, somebody who's hospitalized and requiring TPN or enteral nutrition is usually going to need closer to 1.5 grams per kilogram because of their higher degree of metabolic stress. Usually they have a wound to heal or a broken bone to repair or some other issue. Okay, a quick note about the weight used for calculating nutritional needs. So generally speaking, as you see in letter A here, if the actual weight is less than the ideal body weight, then use the actual weight, because you don't want to feed a cell mass that isn't there or doesn't exist. So if somebody should weigh 70 kilograms, but they're underweight or small or whatever, and they only or have lost weight and they only weigh 60 kilograms, you want to do our calculations based off of that number 60 and not the 70. And sometimes people are more than their actual weight. So 100% would be if I'm supposed to weigh 70 kilograms and I do weigh 70 kilograms, then I'm 100% of my, we'll say, ideal body weight in this case. So some people weigh a little bit more, and up to about 125% of ideal body weight is okay, and you can still use their actual weight. But when it exceeds 125%, they're starting to get into the obese, and that's a lot of extra cell mass that's likely it's going to be mostly adipose tissue, fat, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to feed them in a kcal per kilogram manner if a lot of that body mass is fat. So we use an adjusted body weight, ABW. And here's the formula for adjusted body weight. The actual minus the ideal take that difference and multiply it by 0.25, then you add that amount back to their ideal body weight. So you'll end up something in between their ideal body weight and their actual body weight, depending on how much of it is fat tissue. And here's the equation for ideal body weight for males and females, in case you don't remember it. Okay, so calculations. We'll get started with this. So one thing to be thinking about as you're doing your calculations is what type of format does the hospital or whatever situation you're in want a final prescription. It's very common for a lot of hospitals to actually make the TPN bag with the computerized equipment and so on and so forth, to have it in this type of format where it's dextrose, amino acid, lipid percents. And this is the pharmaceutical percent that you should be familiar with, the weight per volume. And what it means is the percent means how many grams of solute for every 100 mils of solution. For example, if I tell you dextrose 20%, what does that mean? Well, it means there's 20 grams of dextrose for every 100 mils of solution. Now the bag may be 1,000 mils, so it just gives you kind of a concentration indication. So if it was a 1,000 mil bag, then you would know there were 200 grams in 1,000 mils, because 200 grams per 1,000 is the same as 20 per 100, and we call that 20% dextrose. Same thing goes for other fluids and pharmaceuticals. If it's 0.9% sodium chloride, you know there's 0.9 grams of sodium chloride for every 100 mils of that solution. The patient may be getting up to 3,000 mils of sodium chloride solution per day, but you can then calculate how many total grams of sodium chloride or dextrose the patient is receiving. And another important point is the nurse needs to program the infusion pump in terms of milliliters per hour. So it's important, after you've determined your percentages and your volumes, to always remember convert your total milliliters per day that the patient needs to a pump rate. In other words, mils per hour. For an adult, it's usually somewhere between 75 to 100 mils per hour. Okay, so once you've decided how many total kcals the patient should receive, and again we use the Harris-Benedict equation, indirect calorimetry in some cases, but most commonly kcals per kilogram per day, a weight-based dosing. So now we have let's pick a number, 1,800 kilocalories per day is what this patient needs. So how do we divide that up amongst the three macronutrients? We've got dextrose, protein, and fat to consider. This little pie chart here kind of gives you an example of a fairly common dividing scheme that's used. Half of your calories should come from dextrose, and then the other half from fat and protein, usually divided fairly evenly. But there's some cases or some patients who need less dextrose, maybe because they're already hyperglycemic or they have diabetes or some other issue. And some patients need more protein. Maybe they're trauma, burn patients. There's a few other hot cases like high output fistulas, anything that needs to heal. And some patients need less fat. So these lines are flexible, and you can, as long as the total always equals 100, you're in good shape. But generally speaking, this is sort of a general picture of how the macronutrients, kilocalories, should be divided amongst the three. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about is calculating a TPN formula. And there's certain steps that you can go through. These are steps that I use. Different practitioners use a different method. As long as you get to the same place in the end, that's the important thing. But this is just one way of kind of going about approaching or thinking about TPN and getting from kcals to that final prescription like I talked about here, so that the pharmacy can create and process and dispense the TPN order, get it to the patient. So we're just about out of time for this part 2, so we'll continue in part 3 going through these steps in more detail.